One of the most controversial comics, in fact, it stands out in my mind as probably the most controversial comic over the last 25 years or so, is Amazing Spider-Man One More Day. This was the storyline in which Spider-Man makes a deal with Mephisto to save Aunt May's life at the expense of his marriage. And through some trickery, the marriage is dissolved, and Mary Jane and it undoes years of continuity. So what's the controversy here? Well, besides the obvious, and that is, did J. Michael Straczynski actually, who's a writer on this book, did he actually hate the issue, and was he in disagreement but was forced to write this comic? That's some of what's been said. So what's the truth behind it? Hey everybody, this is Perch. One More Day is an infamous storyline in comics, and it kind of depends on your point of view of why you hate it. And maybe you hate it for lots of different reasons, and there are some people who liked it, although I meet very few of those. It stands out in my mind as being one of the most controversial and probably polarizing, although polarizing isn't the right word. Polarizing generally means that you've got people who love it and people who hate it, nothing in between. In this case, most people just hated it. The comic itself it created a lot of anger, and it created anger kind of on two fronts. Either the people who did not like the idea that we were just going to erase Spider-Man's marriage, they liked the pairing of Mary Jane and Spider-Man. Joe Quesada has said a million times that his marriage was making was making Spider-Man get out of touch with his fans, that modern youths of the late 90s would dislike the marriage of Spider-Man and couldn't relate to the character, so it needed to be erased. And he continues to maintain this today as proof. I'm not sure that's ever been really vetted out. A lot of people have memories of kind of Todd McFarlane's run in particular on Amazing Spider-Man and the marriage and that interaction as being very beloved. So I don't know if these fans clamoring around for that marriage to go away really existed, but it was certainly something in Joe's head. But the other big pillar that people get upset with, and I'm seeing over time more, is this idea that we're going to just go in and kind of what felt very ham-fisted at the time, erase continuity, take all these hundreds of issues and just kind of say, nope, we're going to retcon things about the character, and we're just going to kind of undo it in a really kind of goofy way. And there'd always been, there was a kind of a Doctor Strange magic-y thing that went on, and then there was the Mephisto deal that went on, and it's just a lot of kind of silliness with Spider-Man. And keep in mind, this is coming off of the Clone Wars and the Other, and some storylines that a lot of people really had their heads scratching. In fact, if you could point to something that might be a decline in popularity of Spider-Man, you might point to the one where Spider-Man is kind of reborn as a spider through the Other as a clear example of people going, I don't even know what's going on here. But regardless, this is what goes on. This was the storyline that Marvel decides, and in particular, Joe Quesada decides. So what's the holdup here? Well, the writer at the time is J. Michael Straczynski, who had been a writer for a long time and actually written some of these storylines that had been going on, including the Gwen Stacy, love children from Norman Osborn kind of silliness that went on as well. So, and by the way, I mean, for that storyline, it's a whole other video. Joe Quesada, overrode that decision. Straczynski wanted the kids in the Gwen storyline to be Peter's kids. So as this is coming out, J. Michael, sorry, too many J names, posts something on Usenet that heavily criticizes the storyline and talks about how he was kind of overridden by editorial, makes this kind of comment that, as a writer working on a franchise character, you don't have control over these things. You have to accept that. And basically kind of laid out that a lot of fans took to indicate that he really disagreed with the storyline. As we heard more parts of the story, it became unclear if if J. Michael, if he was, Straczynski was actually angry with the storyline or just angry with kind of some of how it went down at the end. We know that parts of his conclusion were kind of, editorial mandate to rewrite them. And so it was unclear what went on. Quesada in later interviews would say that Straczynski was very much on board with this dissolving of the marriage, and that they were doing kind of writer summits that included a bunch of people, including him, Bendis, Mark Miller, Jeff Loeb, Tom Brevoort, Axel Alonso, and that Ed Brubaker and Dan Slott had put some opinions in, and there was at least some agreement that this was going to happen. So I don't think you could say JMS was completely opposed to the marriage going away. I think it was how the marriage going away that actually did it. It did create a kind of interest. I mean, the whole thing created an interesting brief insight into Marvel, where we saw kind of how Quesada was going to put his stamp on things. We saw the rise of in particular, Bendis and Brevoort and some others, Axel Alonso, of how they wanted to handle these characters. It was also interesting that they cite that they only allowed the unmasking of Spider-Man in Civil War, which was a big moment that Miller did, because they knew they were going to erase this marriage, because they knew they were leading up to this One More Day storyline. So the idea was they gave Miller permission to do what he did for that reason, because they knew they were going to undo it a few months later. That's an interesting little fact that comes out, which just indicates that even back then, Marvel was looking at events as not permanent moments. You might remember that Civil War was hyped as forever changing the course of history and of a character's history, and this was certainly true with Spider-Man. That the unmasking was a dramatic event that will change the character's life forever. Well, when that marketing was coming out, Marvel clearly knew it was not going to change the character's life forever, because in a few months' time, they were going to do something else that would change the character's life forever, undoing certain things and bringing other certain things to the table. So it's interesting to see that insight, that these arguments or these discussions and these things were going on, that definitely as fans we were just consuming. Then there's some other disagreements. Getting to the bottom of exactly what JMS. I'm just going to go with that. What JMS was. Really after what he really disagreed with, because there's talk about bringing Gwen Stacy back, and basically parts of the story were rewritten, and JMS asked for his name to be removed, and then it kind of came back on, and then credits need to be amended, and so it's hard to it's kind of sad that this was the cap of his run. He did a long run on the comic, and for that to be the end, and Quesada mentions that this was all kind of a very painful call, and he wishes it could have been different, but he had to make that tough decision. It all is, and so there you go. So then as the years have followed, this story has continued to morph a little bit as fans have continued to be irritated with One More Day. And even though Quesada has never admitted this publicly, I think in hindsight, there's been lots of evidence that shows that the fans were not thrilled about this move, and that it was definitely an unwelcome one, in the sense of certainly the Dan Slott sales went up. You can point to those, and you can point to a lot of success with what they did with Spider-Man and how they positioned them. But the idea that I think some statements were made by Quesada, the fans will be angry for a little bit, and they'll get excited about what Spider-Man's doing, and they'll be back to the table, and they'll have forgotten about this. Well, I mean, here we are, quite a few years later, 15. Well, how many? God, when did One Day? I should. It's been a long time. And the idea that the fans have forgotten about this, now we can say is silly. The fans, it's still very much top of mind, and you get people calling for this thing to be erased, and you get Nick Spencer doing little teases in Spider-Man that Mephisto may be meddling again, so people are like, oh, is it going to get erased? The reaction people had to Mary Jane and Peter getting back together, even dating, just in the last couple of years, has been very, very strong. So it's interesting to see how all this stuff played out. But I think you can debunk a little bit, at least the Straczynski's, his opposition to the storyline was not that he didn't want the marriage to dissolve. It was more how the marriage was dissolved. It was more kind of the format in which it took. Seems to be more the kind of the root of the controversy here. And there's been some interviews and other things that indicate that that's true. There's a panel that Straczynski gave in 2013 where he talked a little bit about this, and he's debunked a little bit. As time has gone by, this continues to be something that fans bring up and continue to kind of push of this big editorial decision overruled, and kind of an example of how Marvel interferes. And it really maybe it doesn't prove that case, it proves different cases, maybe not better cases, just different cases. So that's as much as I can glean from it. It's an interesting moment, and I'm curious at what point things do break down, because Marvel invariably is going to go back to the well at some point to get some sales. When will that moment be? You got to imagine it's soon, but I don't know. The MCU is also blazing forward with new young Peter Parker, so who knows, really. Anyway, do you have any other questions on this? Comments, additions? There's a lot to this story, so I left out a lot. There's a lot of other pieces involved in this whole mess. I was really trying to hone in on the one kind of JMS's comments on Usenet that sparked this kind of controversy between the two. But if you have other thoughts, leave them in the comments below. Like, subscribe. Hey, if you haven't subscribed yet, why not? Please do. Would love to have you here on the channel. Introduce to a friend. Share as much as you like. Would love all of those things to happen. Very much appreciate all of your viewership, your attention. Follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch, and thanks for listening.